Hi, this is Chris from Little Bits of Law, and today is the first episode of Little Bits of Law Talk, where I'm going to be chatting to various experts, allegedly so, in the industry, and we're going to be talking about different areas of law, of course, focusing on the four key things that we do here at law, which are wills law, probate law, divorce law, and of course, child law. So, I have Jeff here today, who's one of the solicitors here at the firm. And let's not be really boring about introducing ourselves. So you just mentioned that you have an Action Man collection. Is that right?
I did actually. I wasn't expecting that to be publicised, but yes, I do actually. I've collected old toys for many years, so
cool.
I've got a lot.
Amazing. How many do you think?
110 probably.
And then my next question is obviously how relevant do you think that is to your expertise in divorce and child law?
Not at all.
Yeah.
Not even remotely relevant.
Excellent. Well, you've been doing this a few years. That's right, isn't it?
In terms of divorce, kids, many years.
Yeah. So what qualified as solicitor when? Come on. Was it pre first or second?
It was probably Crimean, I think. I've dealt with work as a solicitor for over 40 years.
Amazing. So you obviously joined in February when we first opened, which is amazing. And we have a feature called Ask Jeff as well, where we ask you specific questions. But today we're just going to have a chat about divorce. And it was a bit dreary in Preston this morning, so I specifically didn't put my green t-shirt on. So what I did is I ordered from Amazon thinking it would be the green hat ready. So this signifies that all the questions are going to be about divorce. Okay?
Great.
And if it puts you off too much as we're chatting, I'll take it off. So let's start with the very basic. So how does one start a divorce?
The procedures changed a lot. Up until April of last year, divorce could be quite difficult in many ways because you had to prove one of 5 different facts, and 3 of those facts involved being separated for at least 2 years. And the other 2, probably the most common grounds, were based on adultery or behaviour. So it could be pretty nasty in many respects. Then in April of last year, everything changed. And now divorce doesn't involve fault. Fairly straightforward online procedure. And there's no real defence to it. So divorce should and is pretty simple. So when I'm asked about divorce by clients or inquiries, I tend to tell people to do it themselves because it's easy. Pay a court fee and they avoid solicitors' fees by doing it that way.
Well, so before April 2022, you're saying that there was almost like a prosecutor and a defendant in terms of one had to suggest that the other had done certain things in order for the courts to allow a divorce?
Well, there was the adultery ground, which of course involves allegations against the other person, i.e. the other person has committed adultery, or that the other person has behaved, the other spouse has behaved in such a way that they're entitled to divorce based on that conduct. Oh. The other 3 grounds were desertion after 2 years, 2-year separation by agreement, or a 5-year separation without agreement. Right. So there were 3 grounds which didn't involve fault. Right. But even so, the process has been simplified dramatically since then.
And is that with April 2022, that's also the introduction of doing things online and a more streamlined process, which I guess is your point, that people can actually probably, if they're confident enough, can start the admin side of the divorce themselves?
Easy. Online, you move from one question to the next. Very simple, I think. And I really think most people should be able to cope with that process easily.
Brilliant. And so I guess if we follow that through, if you're suggesting that people can do it themselves from the admin perspective, what you're also doing, I guess, is suggesting perhaps that the resources they have financially can be best served by getting advice on financial and childcare matters rather than spending money on that, again, admin side of things.
Yeah, I think there's no point in spending money on solicitors when you don't need to. So if you can do the divorce yourself and save solicitors' fees, well, why not do it? Brilliant. The problem tends to be that although the divorce can be straightforward, the financial aspects of marriage breakdown, if they put it that way, can be far more complicated. And similarly, there can be issues about kids. I mean, mostly, so far as children are concerned, mostly parents sort out the arrangements themselves. all agreed, no issues. Sometimes not so simple.
Got you. Well, actually, as if we discussed this before we started, that is a perfect segue into what the crux of our chat today is going to be about, and that's finances. Right. So it's really important, I guess, to say that as we chat this through, the devil is in the detail. That's a very much a solicitor's statement in terms of we're going to be talking about things theoretically, we're going to be bouncing some ideas around, but it's really important that people know that specific advice is saved for specific circumstances. And they should speak to a solicitor. Obviously, you offer 30 minutes free advice for anyone that wants to have a chat. But I guess that's an important thing to say from the outset. Would you agree?
Yeah. The sort of things we'll be talking about are general to a large extent. And general advice is fine because it gives people an idea of what's involved. But when it comes to specific circumstances, they need specific advice.
Yeah.
So people have to be careful to get that advice, because listening to the general advice, I say, is fine, but it needs to go further than that.
Brilliant, brilliant. So I think from my perspective, when we were chatting this through, the outcome that we're looking for is to take the sting away from the thought of divorce. So this is probably aimed at people that are thinking about a divorce, about to start a divorce, and maybe, as you've discussed, started the admin side of a divorce. But really, there's lots of fears and myths out there, and it'd be really good to chat these through. Do some of them have a basis, do some of them not? And so I guess to that end, let's start with the first thing that I think people will want to know, which is, how much does it cost?
Good question. It can start off as, the cost can be quite low, and they can also be incredibly high. What happens in practice is that many people will come to agreement about the finances without involvement of solicitors. They'll discuss things and they'll agree something that they're both happy with, which is fine. And sometimes what they then want is to put what's been agreed into a court order. Many people, I think, have heard of orders which are called clean break orders, which prevent further claims after the court order has been made. If everything's agreed, that order can be made fairly simply. It's all done through the post, no actual court attendance by anybody. So that can be in a fairly straightforward case. In more complicated cases, you can have situations where people just can't agree. You have assets which can be worth a lot of money in some cases. You have people sometimes with high incomes. You can have pensions, you can have businesses. So it ranges from really simple situations to ultra complicated, and the costs depend upon how complicated it is, and of course whether people get legal advice at all.
Of course, yeah. So, but what about the baseline? So, in order to make an application for divorce, where you're saying to the court, we would like to divorce, I would like to divorce, how much does that cost?
If somebody commences divorce proceedings, then the court fee is £593.
So that's the minimum that you're going to have to pay in order to get a divorce?
Potentially, it's sometimes possible to avoid even paying the court fee, because some people are exempt from paying the court fee based on their income.
Right.
There's a court form, it's a fee remission form. Basically, you fill it in and off it goes to the court, and the court will decide whether you have to pay the whole fee or part of the fee, or no fee.
Brilliant. And so is that something that is signposted? You mentioned before, and of course there's a government website, you log in for the first time, put your details, and one of the things you can do then is start the divorce. Is that signposted, that there's a form at that point?
Yeah.
Yeah, brilliant. So you couldn't accidentally get past that point?
No.
Brilliant. So I guess what we're saying is the more complicated, the more assets, potentially the more negotiation conflicts, and therefore the more cost as a general rule of thumb?
Yes, I think that's probably right, subject to a couple of things. One thing that's pretty important is that even when people get on very well, and many couples do, even when they're divorcing, many couples remain friends, during the divorce and afterwards as well. However, what's very important is that each party understands the financial position of the other party. And in marriage, sometimes that's just not the case. So I would always advise that even if people are getting on well, they make sure that they have documentary evidence dealing with the financial position of the other party. Right. So they fully understand the overall financial position, things like bank statements for last year, any accounts, wage slips, P60s, evidence of pensions, evidence of any other assets, valuations of houses, whatever the assets are. Make sure that there's documentary evidence dealing with all of these things so that before coming to any agreement, you completely understand what it is you're actually agreeing to.
Brilliant. So let's start to sort of piece this together for those that are sort of looking at the road, if you will, of the divorce. So we've got the admin side first. You start, or your soon-to-be ex-partner starts that admin part. They pay the court fee. And then what happens? Are we straight into swapping these kind of things financially in terms of...
No particular order. I mean, some people sort out the finances to some extent even before they start off the divorce. In other words, some people start talking about finances, you know, at an early stage.
Are there advantages to that or disadvantages to that?
I think if you've decided the marriage has broken down, I suppose the sooner you get on with things, the better, whichever one it is. Yeah. I probably am in favour of getting the divorce going first. Okay. Doesn't have to happen that way, really. But another thing I was going to mention is this: if it's not necessarily a matter of going to court if you can't come to agreement, then there's also the issue of mediation.
Right.
And mediation is an ultra important thing. So
what is mediation for those that are not sure?
Right. First option is to come to agreement with your partner, your spouse, I should say. And sometimes easy. Sometimes people come to agreement, completely happy with it, should still have the disclosure. Ultimately, it's up to them whether they do that or not.
And disclosure being the swapping
all this
of those.
Documentation, exchange of documents so they both know what the other person's financial position is. If they can't come to agreement, the real question is, well, what happens next? So we have these issues, we haven't resolved them, so how do we deal with it? It's best not to simply ask the court to sort everything out for various reasons. But even before you come to that, there's this thing called mediation, and there are people who are trained mediators, and they're good. Right. And what then happens is, or what should happen is one of the parties contacts a mediator, and the mediator will talk to that person, and they have a thing called a MIAM, Mediation Information Assessment Meeting.
Well remembered, that.
It
absolutely.
is. Perhaps
I've been doing it a few years.
Oh, yeah, I've heard the term a few times. So the spouse, so to speak, whichever one it is, husband or wife, has this meeting. And at that point, the mediator will describe what's involved in mediation, and they'll together decide whether mediation is a good idea or not. Mm-hmm. And in most cases, it is. If it is, then the mediator will contact the other spouse, the husband or the wife, and invite that person to have another one, MIAM. So that's what will happen. And then the mediation will start.
Where the two parties come together? Yes.
And normally there's the mediator and the parties in the same room. It can be different, but that's usually what happens. It can be remote as well. The mediator will still want disclosure. So the mediator will still want this exchange of documentation so that the mediator understands the financial position. And the mediation sessions, it can involve a number of different sessions. And it can involve a lot of discussion. And incidentally, mediation can also deal with children issues as well. If there are children issues, it's not just confined to finances.
Is that in the same mediation, let's say, sessions, or would you have mediation sessions for finances and then for child arrangements?
Probably separate, just because of time constraints. But you go through the process, and the hope is that agreement will be reached via the mediation. So it tends to be quicker, it's more amicable.
Because it's a collaboration with someone else rather than, dare I say, awful solicitors like ourselves sending letters and sending emails. Yes,
it's quick. You get immediate responses, don't you, when both people are sitting in the same room. So it helps, and many cases are resolved by mediation. What the mediator would normally then want is for there to be a court order dealing with the agreed terms. The mediator doesn't do that. The mediator said, right, go off to your solicitor and get the order sorted out, dealing with the agreed terms, possibly dealing with the clean break.
Right. So that little period between the mediator saying this has been a success or we've narrowed the outstanding issues, go off now and get this formalised in a court order, as you call it. And I think it's worth saying, by order, what we're discussing here is where the court effectively rubber stamps things. They order certain things to happen, and you agree what you want the court to order.
Yeah, the court. What happens is that the court has sent a draft court order and a financial form, and the financial form deals with the financial position of both parties. Quite a long form. It's well over 20 pages now. Used to be 3 pages a few years back, but and I was perfectly happy with the 3 pages. So that goes to the judge. The judge isn't a rubber stamp as such because he looks at it. So
of course, yeah.
He checks that the order makes sense based on the content of the financial form.
So there are circumstances, again, I'm sort of speculating a bit here, but if the assessment by the judge and the reality of the finances don't marry, don't meet, excuse the pun, and there's essentially it's not a good decision that's been made by either partner or both, does the judge have the opportunity to say, no, I don't like this?
It would tend to be more, what would tend to happen is the judge would query it.
Right.
So the judge could even have a hearing to ensure that both parties understand exactly what it is they're doing.
Wow.
If both parties are represented, and this is probably a plague for solicitors in a way, that tends not to happen, simply because the judge assumes, rightly or wrongly, rightly hopefully, that they've been properly advised.
Got you.
In which case it's more likely the judge is more likely to approve it. One other thing though in relation to mediation is that normally the mediator has a preference that the parties do get some legal advice on it.
Before, even or during, after?
During and before the court order's made.
Got you. And that was, forgive me, one thing I was going to ask. So between the agreement and the court order, this little sort of grey area while things are being formalised, is that binding? Is what happens in mediation binding and we're waiting for the assessment by the judge? Or could you go to mediation, agree it in good faith, and then the day after perhaps get some legal representation and they say, no, this is a bad deal and the whole thing's off?
Yeah, and I would do that. If it was clear to me that agreement's been reached in mediation, which doesn't make any sense, then I would be saying to my client, this makes no sense. You'd hope, of course, you'd never get to that stage because the best way of dealing with it was to get the advice as the process is going through,
right.
Not waiting to the very end when you've actually come to an agreement.
Right.
Doesn't make a lot of sense to do it that way, really.
Brilliant. All right, so we've gone through that there's mediation is definitely a good step. Let's say that we're past mediation now. Well, I suppose actually some of the questions I've got could be discussed in mediation, but let's talk with a few more specifics now. So things that I've asked a couple of friends that have gone through divorces, and obviously you speak to clients all the time. Some of the more common questions that come up, let's use number one as the first example. I have a house with my spouse. What happens? Do we sell it?
Well, there's no way I'm going to give a straight answer on that one.
Right.
It really does all depend on the circumstances.
So what are the circumstances more generally then? Are you looking at the whole
Depends.
thing?
If you're looking at, I suppose, the holistic approach, you could say. You're looking at all the assets, you're looking at the overall financial position, because in some cases it is a matter of selling a property. It's a matter of dividing the assets and parties just going their own ways. It can be as simple as that. But it's often the case that children involved.
Mm-hmm.
There can be pensions, which can be incredibly important, and there are sometimes, some cases, where the pensions are worth more than all the other assets combined.
Wow.
You can have situations where their business is complicated, and very obvious one is that people's income can be vastly different. It can be the case that maybe it doesn't have to be the wife, it could be the husband, but one of them has looked after the children, sacrificed their career to some extent when the other person's moved on. So it's perfectly possible for one spouse to be earning a fortune and the other one to be earning virtually nothing.
So what really are we talking about here? Are we talking about fairness and balance? I'm sort of prodding you towards something there, of course. What is it that we're aiming to achieve when looking at all of the assets and dividing them?
What you're trying to ensure is that both people are able to carry on after the divorce and make ends meet.
Right.
And often that can be, as I say, a matter of dividing assets. But if you have somebody it tends to be the husband, doesn't have to be, but if you say have a husband that's earning a high wage and the wife that's earning not a great deal, the real question is, how is she going to cope afterwards if she doesn't get maintenance, for example?
Got you.
Or she might not want it. She might just say, right, I want maintenance for the kids, which is fine, but she might be entitled to maintenance for herself. Or she might say, no, I don't want maintenance for me. I would like to have more capital. So instead of having half the property, I'll have more than half. Or that there can be other assets. You get things like ISAs and really expensive cars and antiques or whatever it is. And in many cases, there aren't. In many cases, just a house and people who don't have a lot of money. And it tends to be more simple in that situation.
Sure.
The more assets there are, the more complicated it tends to be.
So it sounds a little bit, the image in my head as you speak is almost like a seesaw, you know, and we're making sure that it doesn't have to be, right, there's a house, we'll carve that in half. What's in the joint account, we'll carve that in half. It comes down to what do each party need that might be different, and that plays itself out on what they get in terms of whether, like you say, it's capital, it's the house itself. So it's more fluid, I guess, than perhaps people appreciate. Would that be right?
Yeah. The outcome should be based upon the particular circumstances in the case. Again, you look at the assets, you look at the income, and then you take it from there. So there's no specific rule that you can use.
Right.
So one case doesn't fit all, you might say.
Right.
So that's why it's incredibly important to get really specific advice. So therefore, don't assume you're only entitled to half of the assets. Don't assume that you are entitled to half the assets. It just depends on the circumstances.
Does the fact that someone might have behaved inappropriately affect their sort of portion of the pie, if you will? So if we think about someone who's committed adultery, does that person get penalised financially? I know we said before it won't stop the divorce anymore because the no-fault divorces are in, but what about from the finances?
Normally, it has no impact whatsoever upon finances. Occasionally, there's some relevance, but that tends to be financial misconduct, you might say.
Right.
Somebody that's hiding money. Somebody that's spent a staggering amount of money just before the divorce. Somebody that's transferred assets elsewhere. They're financial considerations where conduct can make a difference. If it's behaviour, somebody's been nasty, you know, for years potentially. Somebody's committed adultery, usually makes no difference. Right. And in a way, it's right that it shouldn't make a difference, because if the financial outcome was based upon allegations, then of course you'd have divorces which have allegations, counter-allegations, and the whole thing would become horrendous. In reality, the court are looking at how much money is there, how much property is there, and how do we deal with it. They're not trying to say you get a bit more because he's been nasty or she's been nasty. It wouldn't work.
Got you. So what about in terms of your Actionman collection? How long have you been married for now? Let's play around with this idea. So how long have you been married?
18 years.
18 years, okay. So a couple of questions based on you and your lovely wife divorcing. Will she watch this, by the way? If she watches this, maybe this might instigate some proceedings.
I'll try and prevent it.
Okay. So, two things. Number one, let's look at your Actionman set. Let's say it's worth £1,000. How would that be divided in the circumstance that there isn't much capital? Let's say that that's an example of all of your assets, financial worth, being wrapped up in things like your Actionman. Does the court have the power to make you sell those in order to produce what I would call liquid cash?
Theoretically, yes. That's not how it would work in practice, really. If I had assets, I mean, £1,000 would make no difference in reality. But say I had collections worth £50,000 and there were no other assets. The question is, would I then have to sell? I think the court would expect me to provide some money to my wife in lieu of her claim against it. Very difficult to foresee the outcome in relation to Actionman, I suppose. But certainly it's an asset. Yeah. And, you know, and if that was the case, my wife may well say, no, I'm not really interested in having half your Actionman. Pretty sure she would say that, actually, now I think about it. But she might say it's worth something, so give me some money. But difficult to predict that one, really.
Of course. And what about in terms of, forgive me, did you say 16 years? 18. 18. Yeah, just checking this, just in case she is watching. In terms of those 18 years, let's say it's now at the point of divorce, the stuff up for grabs, is it just the finances that have accumulated in those 18 years or prior to that?
Again, good question and a difficult question to answer. In most cases, particularly on longer marriages, then it doesn't really matter where the assets came from or when they were acquired.
Right.
So usually you're talking about looking at everything. So say I had a pension which I've been paying into for 30 years, then it's likely that the court would consider the whole of that pension relevant.
Right.
It can be different. Again, there are situations where people have lots and lots and lots of money and can be very wealthy. And then the position can be different then. But it's complex.
Right. Got you. So we've established that. Now let's say that there is a disabled child or disabled spouse within the relationship. Can that affect the distribution of finances?
It all comes down really to money. If somebody is disabled, then they may have a greater need than somebody that's not disabled.
Okay.
You look at the practical situation they're in terms of what their income is, both of them, and what they need. So it may be that a disabled child has a greater need for support, as you'd expect, than one that's not disabled. And of
So
course,
where's the distinction though between child maintenance and the division of finances in order to accommodate the child?
Again, really does depend upon the nature of the disability. If you have a property, for example, which is purpose-built or partly purpose-built, you might say, for a child, then of course that's relevant. But again, very difficult to generalize, because if you're talking about divorce, you're talking about what happens to the child after divorce. Of course, it could be just a matter of shared care, in which case both parties would say probably exactly the same thing. We both have a need to have support for this child. And even if a child's living in one place, whether disabled or not, and seeing the other person, very often the other person is having less contact. So it could be that the child's living with one party for 5 nights a week and the other with 2. It still means even the person with 2 nights still needs a home in which that child can stay.
Of course.
So it may not make a huge amount of difference in practice, but like everything, it depends on the circumstances.
Of course. All right, well, let's have some whistle-stop questions now. So whether it makes an effect or has an effect or not, don't worry. I won't throw too many machine gun bullets at you, but let's whiz through. So what about, is everything in the joint account split 50-50 when the finances are divided?
Nope.
And I guess that's because of what you just discussed now, which is far more fluid than that.
You look at all the assets. So of course, if it could be that that there's £1,000 in a joint account, and you could say, well, £500 each. On the other hand, of course, there could be an account in the husband's name with £20,000 in. So what would happen to that? In reality, what you do is you look at them as a whole. See how much. If there are 5 accounts with £30,000 in, one with 10 in one person's name, one with 20 in the person's name, and the other a joint account, you're looking at them all and seeing how they can achieve a sort of equality. But even then, it depends on the other assets. You've got to consider everything. There's no easy way of doing that.
What about debts? So let's say I am divorcing and I have £10,000 on a credit card. The beneficiaries are both me and my wife. So I took that £10,000 out, I don't know, to give us a new kitchen. Because that credit card is in my name, does that mean that when we divorce, I take that debt with me, or is it again put into the pot, if you will, that debts need to be paid upon our divorce, out of joint assets, if you will?
Well, 2 ways of looking at it in a way, I think. One is from the lender's point of view. If you borrowed the money, it's contractually a debt that you have to pay. So the lender is not going to care whether you're getting divorced or not. They'll say you owe X amount of money, pay up. When it comes to the divorce, if they're assets, then the argument should be, well, I'm left with a debt which was for a joint benefit. And therefore, when you divide the assets, you take that into account. You
do take it into account, yeah.
Yeah, reasonable to take it into account. But once again, it has to come back to, depends on what the assets are.
Of course.
Again, it might be that a party that's got the debt, say it was a £20,000 debt, could say, right, I want you, the other party, to pay half. That party may say, well, hang on a minute, you earn 4 times more than me, so you have to take into account the actual financial position.
That's definitely the theme of our chat so far, isn't it?
Yeah, it's
All needs to go together
yeah.
rather than looking at these specific things.
Looking at it piecemeal it doesn't work in reality for most
It's
people.
unfortunate you've said that because I'm going to give you another piecemeal question.
Okay. I can cope.
What about pets? That's an obvious one. So we have a pet together, we have a dog together. What happens?
You could have a shared residence, I suppose, to some degree, but as that's probably unlikely. A dog, I probably will offend people when I say this, and I've had a wonderful dog, but a dog is a chattel. A dog is goods.
Chattel being goods, what we're saying,
Goods.
it's an
yeah,
object.
like a fridge, you could say. Probably more entertaining, but it's similar into it from a legal perspective. So the dog belongs to the person who's bought it. Or if it's a gift to somebody, so if one person buys it for the other person, then of course the person receives the gift, the dog belongs to that person.
That's really interesting. So if I buy the dog for my wife, essentially it's the wife's primary decision as to what happens to the dog because I've gifted.
Because the dog belongs to your wife.
But if I buy it and I never utter those words, "This is for you, darling,"
well, then you'd have to look at the circumstances at the time.
Got you. No, that's really interesting. Is there anything that pops up for you more often than not that you think our viewers and listeners will be most interested in? What's the thing that you get the most where people come and say, Jeff?
There's lots of things really. What tends to happen is I get a call for some basic initial advice, which is quite good. I'm happy to give it. And then most people, with the benefit of that advice, want to go and talk to their wife or husband. That's good as well, to see whether they can come to some sort of agreement. It's just like sort of starting point, really. And talking is pretty good in most cases. Some people can't for all sorts of reasons. It just doesn't happen. So
that first interaction with you is almost empowering you to go and collaborate with your husband, wife, civil partner.
The idea is really I go through the basics in terms of length of marriage, kids, how old are they, income, assets,
all these things that we discussed. You're jotting these down.
Pretty much, and then say, right, okay, my initial view is this. So I'll give them an idea of what I think. It's all subject to more detailed discussions, really, but it gives them an idea at least. And then they go away with some thought in terms of what they want and some ideas of what's relevant. And that helps, I think. So that's usually the way it starts. Can start, in many other ways. People are sort of 3/4 of the way through the court proceedings and then decide they really should have got some legal advice, and they run right to the end. I've got a hearing coming up in a few weeks, and you think, oh no, oh my God. And then it can be quite difficult.
Yeah, no, that sounds the challenge. So obviously from our perspective, what we always do is, and the reason why we're doing this is we want to educate and we want to give people the confidence to be able to, if there's, 10 steps and you feel like you can do 3 or 4 yourself, do it. Providing though that you're loaded with the confidence and the information that you need.
Yeah.
Because again, the last thing we want is to be in a situation where people are feeling like they can do something and perhaps can, ability-wise, but just need a little bit more information and context in order to guide them the way. And that's something that you believe in as well. Okay, last couple from me. What about the myth, the legend that is courts hate dads? So again, think about it from a financial perspective. So we're talking really now, there's the mother in the marital home, and I know this isn't true, but just guide us through how courts look at mums and dads, or husbands and wives, civil partner, whatever we're talking about in terms of, is there any sort of favouritism from the courts or anything when it comes to the distribution of finances?
No, I don't think so. People tend, I think, to think that courts favour the wife, particularly in relation to children issues.
Sure.
And I'll mention that in a second, but no, I don't think so. I suppose people can get the impression that the court favours the wife, but it tends to be that the reason for that, I think, is that it's usually the wife that's in the weaker financial position. Not always.
Sure.
And therefore, if the court's favouring the wife, all they're doing is favouring the person that's in the more difficult financial position, which is completely reasonable.
Absolutely. And you mentioned that before, didn't you? I think convention, again, there's always going to be exceptions, but convention might suggest that the wife brings up the children, and there's an element of sacrifice that comes with that. So it wouldn't be right to sacrifice your career over 10, 15 years to bring up the children that you're very proud of, to then have to go through a divorce and be looking at the husbands thinking, you're here because of the sacrifices I made, and I now need to start from a much more disadvantaged position. Is that what you're talking about in terms of that?
Well, if many people get the impression that that the courts are favouring the wife, I would just say they're not doing that. It's not a matter of favouring the wife or even favouring the husband, depending on the circumstances. Sure. It's just looking at the overall financial position and trying to balance it.
Yeah,
and of course, it's quite right. As you said, it tends to be the wife that's given up a career, earned less, maybe not paid into a pension. Can be all sorts of things. Can be the other way around, of course, as well. You get plenty of husbands that does exactly the same thing in a way, and wives work in exactly the same way as husbands, of course. But that's the reason for it. And the other thing I was going to mention is that the impression, I think, is also there, and still very much there, that the court favours fathers over mothers of children, and I don't think it's the case. It can be the case that the mother has been the primary carer for years, and that in some cases the father hasn't had much involvement with the children, and in some cases the father has more involvement with the children than the mother. So again, it's all based on the circumstances, and I have to say I find the courts really fair. Yeah. When dealing with these issues, so that the court comes in for a lot of criticism from all sorts of different sources. And in my experience, over many, many years, the criticism is not justified. The court is ultra careful in doing the right thing for the children. And the courts tell the parties pretty much, not quite so bluntly, but we're not particularly interested in you, we're interested in the children.
Wow.
And that's how it should be.
Well, we'll definitely talk all about child arrangements. I'll bring a yellow hat at that time, of course. Is there anything that, as we sort of summarise and end, that taking away from our chats, or a theme that you want to, I guess the theme that you've said, and we're obviously repeating it now to the point that we might be boring people, but it's so important, isn't it, that taking everything into account? Is that the theme of the discussion that we've just discussed, do you think? That's what listeners should take away from it? Yeah, I think so. It's not a good idea to try and look at one asset, decide it's 50-50 or otherwise, and ignore everything else, because everything is interconnected in reality when it comes to dividing assets. The only other thing I'd say, as a bit of general advice, for what it's worth, is that divorce can be pretty scary, and for some people it can be the worst part of their lives, and the worry about finances and what's going to happen to them and how they're going to cope is a justified worry, and as I say, it's really quite frightening for people. What I can say, again, based on many, many years' experience, is that people get through it, and many people are actually happier afterwards, because divorce happens for a reason, I think. And when people have been through the process, they get on with their lives afterwards, and many people, I have to say, are far happier as a consequence of it. Just my belief based on vast experience. Brilliant. Well, obviously, thank you very much. It wasn't too bad in the end, was it? No. No, brilliant. Thanks very much. And thanks very much for watching.